Hello, welcome to GW Book Club, where my friend Stu and I read through classic Games Workshop fiction set in the many different worlds of Warhammer. This time, we have read Malekith by Gav Thorpe. This is a story of the Sundering, book one in a trilogy from Black Library's Time of Legend series. It explores the origins of the Dark Elves and how Malekith, a once great prince of the High Elves, would become the Witch King, an evil force that almost destroys all of his kin. This is going to be a very special episode of the book club, though, because it's not just me and Stu talking about this book. We've been joined by author Gav Thorpe himself. Gav, thanks so much for joining me and Stu for a very special GW book club talking about Malekith. I guess a cool place to start would probably be how the Time of Legends even came about at Black Library. Like, how did these stories set in the deep history of the Warhammer world get conceived?
I think it's fairly straightforward, which was like Heraldry did really well. So it was like, let's do some history for Warhammer. Like, let's do the big stories, the big stories of the big past sort of thing. And there's a few that would stand out. There was the Sundering. There's obviously the founding of the Empire that Graham did, and a bunch of other ones. And Warhammer's always been quite founded on some of these very pivotal, like either eras or character stories. So I think, it was as simple as that. Really, it was just at the time. I mean, Warhammer was doing it right, but it was just like, okay, how can we get the Warhammer book sales closer to the 40k book sales, I think was the thing, and actually having a few real kind of like tentpole event series, but obviously they'd have to be historical. So it was like the Warhammer Legends came about, which was odd because I think a few years previously, I probably when I was Warhammer Law, took over to Warhammer Law Master, so like 2000. So sometime in the early 2000s, as a writer, I'd already pitched the idea of doing the Sundering books. Right. I just thought that'd be cool, and obviously at the time they said, "Well, it's not really what we're doing," and then then later on it was. So it was.
Was that why you went for the elves specifically, because you'd already looked at the Sundering, or did you just fancy getting into it?
It was a combination, a little bit, and because we'd recently redone like the High Elves and the Dark Elves army books and things, so they were very much in my mind. And just like how cool the story it was, basically. Like, it was just like, actually, this is brilliant, brilliant Bill King original background. Same with the Skaven, same with the original Undead background and the Gash stuff and all that. So it was a case of like, yeah, actually, no, this would be great, and there was enough there because it's a very character-driven story from like it wasn't like just some big battles that happened where we'd have to add a lot in. It's like, because Bill had already done it, it's already got quite an arc to it in terms of the people. So yeah, and having done a few, there's a very Warhammer story, of like hero to villain and stuff like that as well. So it really, like Malekith's particular journey just appealed, but the idea of doing the Sundering and like it's kind of almost fully formed as like the Witch King, the Shadow King, and the Phoenix Kings, kind of, which were the original titles. So, but then it was decided we didn't name it after the characters that but yeah, it was apart from Shadow King, because nobody knew who Alistair Noah was. So yeah, it was just good. It kind of, like I say, it kind of came fully formed as an idea of this trilogy and this great story of the Sundering, but through these three different perspectives rather than following one particular character. Although I did start the first attempt to write Malekith, I got completely wrong, and I've done about 15, 20,000 words, and I've done it from. He does appear in one of the later versions actually as a character, but I started doing it from the perspective of a captain, like a high elf captain, and kind of witnessing events and stuff like that. And it turned into one of the later scenes where they end up breaking in Calador, where they end up breaking a cult and stuff. And then I was just like, actually, I'm just doing the thing that I really disliked other writers doing, which was like not tackling the main character they're supposed to be about. and it's like no, just get in the head of the character. So we scrapped that. I was like realized that was completely the wrong way to go. Started again, but from actually, Malekith. I really focused on Malekith rather than the Sundering as a big story sort of thing. It was like no, this is their character journey, and follow it through in each volume, which I think makes it a lot stronger.
Would that have been Carathril? Is that the
Yes.
captain? Right, but yeah. So
Yes,
you
that's it.
still
Yes,
get some
well,
of that, don't you, from his perspective for specific moments? You sort of
yeah,
see.
yeah, no, exactly. He was a useful character to have, but starting with him was like, no, but that makes it his story.
Sure.
And it was like, no, it's not his story. He's just one of the, kind of observers, witnesses, I suppose. So, yeah, yeah. So, and also just like, never let, words go to waste.
Why do you think you focus on that approach to start with? Do you think it was because you've grown up with the established lore yourself and you felt like you were retelling and expanding on it, or was it a different reason?
Yeah, I think so. It was, and it was just like the most standard way to do it in my head was just, it was to almost just approach stuff chronologically, just try, because it was like, okay, what do we need to do? Okay, we need to show the build up of the cults and the undermining, and kind of like almost just go through it like that in a very, I say, in a very kind of chronological way almost. And actually, then I was like, got to a certain point, it went, yeah, but this isn't actually the story we should be telling. This is like we can focus much more on the characters, the movers and shakers, as it were. So, and make it much more biographic novels rather than historical novels. If you understand, sort of see the difference there. So yeah, Carisfield, that was it. He was like I say, yeah, I liked him and what he was doing, but it was like it wasn't appropriate to kick off and focus on that right from the outset. And also just then helped me get a bit more of a voice. I think of changing things and going back to the first council and kind of like, and just like, yeah, actually, how did it all start? How, where did it all go from? Rather than the symptoms, go back to the cause almost of, which was cool. Again, it's a great story of how chaos won, which I kind of revisited in the End Times Kane book, but that's kind of it's because it's got that whole elves and it's all just giant cycles of time. To them it's like every story is the same story again, a little bit, but just in a new age. So, which I deliberately lent on because actually a lot of the stuff that they ended up doing in the End Times was kind of just a repeat of stuff that had happened before I'd already written about. So I thought I might as well lean into it. But so yeah, well, the idea of it also. Because we were working on the Dark Elves background at the time and stuff, I was able to not actually tweak, but put certain emphasis into the army book that made writing the trilogy easier. Because look, it's in the official army book, so therefore I was able to work both ends at once, basically, from the novel at one point, and then actually like putting just a couple of dropping a couple of mentions of certain things into the history of the army book as well. So privileges of position.
One of the luxuries of writing an epic story about elves is that you can have these characters exist through that entire timeline. It's not like humans, where if you want to do ages and enormous change and cultural change, where you'd have to have many characters and generations of characters. Here, like Malekith is literally at the start, at the second Phoenix King, right the way through to obviously the fall. That's like 1,500 years, isn't it, of time?
Yeah.
And you get to go through all of these different phases of his life, and it makes the story feel really epic. It's a proper legend.
Yes, yeah. That was one of the other things, was to make. I'm a Dwarf fan, and so the great thing about writing Sundering was like I got to kill loads of elves, but actually, I wanted to put the awe and the amazingness back into elves as well, a bit, like in terms of, I mean, not back into, I suppose, but through a novel to show it. Like say, yeah, these are these amazing like beings that, like say, yeah, have lived for a long time, and particularly that particular bloodline. They're very long lived, and we know that they, through dark sorceries and stuff, continue to live for many more thousands of years. But also touched that idea of, I really liked the idea that that self-fulfilling prophecy almost also of Cain drawing of an Aryan drawing the sword of Cain and sort of cursing his bloodline, and what did that actually mean? And again, it's mythic, genuinely mythic, and so for me, it's the same as like writing about Achilles or Hercules or whatever, but in the Warhammer world. So these larger than life characters, treating those stories as true. They are true, but you know what I mean? It's like getting right into the characters behind it and the day to day of it almost. Like, well, what does it mean though that their bloodline was cursed? Well, actually, here we go. We'll have a look at this, and also particularly because the Malekith and sort of touched on this. It's the idea of like the victory of chaos over the elves wasn't like they tried like trying to overrun them with like a billion demons, and that didn't work. So they worked on, they destroyed them from within instead. And and people sort of say, oh, they're chaos elves and stuff. Okay, well, there are, but they didn't, but not overtly in the same way that you get, or not very often. It's like no, their corruption is different. Same with the dwarfs. They were built to resist corruption, but actually they've ended up, their personalities, their societies got corrupted in a different way. They didn't just sort of like start growing extra heads and stuff like that, but their personalities and things, who they were, their culture became corrupted by chaos instead. And in terms of their reaction to chaos, the Malekith is very much that story of a small pebble or relatively small pebble being amplified by chaos and the whispers of chaos and all the rest of it into an avalanche.
Mm. Yeah, because Malekith,
the Warhammer story.
It's a great, and it's a fantastic Warhammer story for that reason, absolutely. And that the corruption of chaos is always a big part of the Warhammer world, and it's writ large here. But I quite like just thinking about Malekith as a character, like because obviously we know where he ends up, and he's been a bad guy like my entire life. He's always been the bad guy. So reading it from his perspective, and he's a good guy. It's a fine line. It's a tricky line to walk, actually, and I think you do a really good job of keeping him like he is noble and heroic at times, and he does cool stuff, and his relationship with the dwarves is fantastic. There's always that hint of the malice and the underlying darkness that could turn him to evil throughout, and obviously it's only later on that really becomes like who he is. But yeah, it must have been a tightrope trying to walk that, I imagine.
Yeah, I suppose it's like without making too much of a comparison, but it's a bit like the Horus Rising thing. It's the fall has to for the fall to count. It has to start from a high place, and so he has to. I didn't want it. Again, he was. There was a reason he engenders such loyalty, and his followers will follow him into to the ends of the earth, as it actually turns out, and stuff like that. And that's not just because they're all corrupted with him. It's because it's like he's a genuine hero, charismatic. Puts himself out there, and is again, and how much of that is him? How much is the kind of vector of corruption through Morathi, and the fact that she was captured by the Slaneshi cults and demons and all that kind of stuff. So, was the seed from that, and actually, that's and her. How much of I didn't want it to be one of the things over the entire series, but particularly Malekith, is his relationship with Morathi, which obviously is very important. And I didn't want her being the sole. Again, I don't like character agency being taken away from a lot of the big Warhammer characters, which can happen sometimes because we end up like events, dear boy, events, and it's like they were wrong. It's like no, they make everyone, especially chaos. Chaos is all about making a decision. Well, I think we might talk about this before. There's always a point of no return, and the characters have to willingly step over that line and decide. And for Malekith, it's right at the end of Malekith. With in the shrine and stuff, is he makes the selfish choice rather than the selfless choice, and that's his damnation. But the voices that have been speaking to him, the Jiminy Cricket or the angels and the devils and stuff that have been chatting to him up to that point, and Morathi's the big devil on the one shoulder. It's like was really interesting, but I didn't want it to be solely that. It's like again, it has to be within within him to be this. And basically, that is that we always start to listen to the things that we want to hear.
I was going to ask about that, and actually that balance between, was it difficult balancing his mother's influence, which is clearly strong, but you also see large periods of the book where he's very much his own man. He is strong. He actually pushes her away, and it feels like it's balanced perfectly. So you've given him that agency that you were just talking about. Were there any points where you felt, oh, I need to rewrite that bit because it does feel like she's got too much influence or too much the other way?
There were probably, I don't remember specifics, but there probably were slightly bits. Because again, she was an amazing character to write because she is this almost like Disney-esque villain, and unashamedly like ambitious and all the rest of it. She's from the very outset, and then that's kind of like how she's portrayed, sort of in the original like story from Bill King, which is she's and she's scheming and all the rest of it, but she also is, again, not wrong necessarily in terms of like the birthright of an Aryan and what he did for the elves, and there's that fear of that kind of like means that they don't choose Malekith as the successor and all the rest of it. But all on the other side, it's like, yeah, but they see the other rest of the elves see something, and they're not wrong. And I suppose that is the tension all the way through of like that decision. Was that decision right or wrong? Which follows all the way through, and I quite liked that looped all the way into the end times. 7,000 years later, it's like still comes back to that decision of how much was that rejection what forced Malekith down the path he was, and ended up it all going bad. And if he'd just been accepted as Phoenix King, would he have turned out okay? Or were they right to, because he did have that darkness in him? And there's no answer. That's the whole point. Is like none of it. We'd never end up with a yes, they were right, yes, no, they were wrong, because that's boring. Because that ends the discussion. Whereas it's like so and Morathi's part in that, and of course she gets worse as the story goes on, really, and more determined, but essentially abandons him as well at some points. It's mutual. They have, they use each other, they love each other, they and all the rest of it in the way that kind of like these sort of like weird powerful families often do, and they understand that they're each other's their best ally and worst enemy at the same time, because Morathi wants to make him the most powerful, like wants to make him king and stuff, but how much of that is for him and how much of it is for her own power, and make him an instrument of her will. And he's very aware of that, but he also understands he won't necessarily get to that place without her and needs her support and the rest of it. So but understands that her jealousy of him, and that is always, again, it's like there's a lot of issues going on there. But that's elf. It's elf psychodrama. That's what's cool. And again, the elves. We don't necessarily make as much point about it with the elves as we do the Eldar stuff. But this, this heightened emotion and this connection to Slanesh and stuff isn't quite as much there in Warhammer as it is in the 40k thing. But it's still there. It's like they still have these long lives, and they get very bored in some ways, and they have to indulge in these politics and this melodrama to keep themselves to make life interesting. Because they, like I say, they've done it all. The mundanity of life of just like existing would just grind them down otherwise. So even the high elves, in inverted commas, who are the good guys, are still like conniving, politicking, scheming, sort of like and kind of always engaging in like one-upmanship and bads and all this kind of stuff, because otherwise what's the point of existence, eh?
I actually really like that as well. Yeah, because it adds so many more layers and dimensions to the elves for me. Just how exactly, it ironically kind of makes them more human, because they are politicking and they're not this uniformed. Certainly at this time in this story, they're not the high elves, and they're all just this one army all together with the same viewpoints and fighting the same wars. They all have their own agendas. The princes are all, there is sort of, backstabbing and politicking, machinations and stuff, which is really effective. And Belshazzar as well as the Phoenix King, I think, was really interestingly drawn in the book, because it is a legend, right? So I was almost imagining that, I'm being told this story, in a tavern in the old world. So like the Belshazzar that we're getting is through Malekith's perspective. because he actually seems to be a pretty good Phoenix King in that, he does lead them to prosperity for thousands of years or 1,000 years, and yet Malekith is like, oh, he's rubbish. He's he's doing all this.
Yeah.
So is his mother as well. They're constantly saying that he's terrible at the job, but he doesn't seem to be terrible. He seems quite wise, and he even doesn't trust Malekith at the end in just almost the right moment.
Yes. Well, yeah, exactly. And again, I suppose Malekith sees leadership very much in the mold of Venerean of going out and hitting things with a big sword. And that's really what a king should be doing. And but as the sense that, again, he understands that politic, which is why he removes himself from Orthwan and goes to the New World and basically conquers a new nation there. And creates his own power base as well. And one of the other things is, and it was very useful chatting to Rick Priestley at this time, which was about some of the slight underpinnings of it, which is the idea of these city-states, or these proto-nations, which is very much kind of a bit like the Greek nation-state. So although Orthwan is like the Elven island, homeland sort of thing, it's not necessarily united in that way that we necessarily consider it to be. And so even though one of the kings of, it's had a Phoenix King under very, again, we have to understand that these are extraordinary times, actually, that up until Anarian, that they didn't have a king, they just had the Ever Queen, and lived in this kind of slightly idyllic situation, and then chaos came, and they needed a war leader, and and Anarian came, and even he wasn't supposed to, he went nuts and drew the sword of Cain and turned into a crazy bloodthirsty tyrant, basically. But that's what they needed then, and then put the sword away just about, or disappeared with it, and all the rest of it. So, there's also the element of like, oh, we need a new king. Of like, well, we didn't have. Why do we need a king? We didn't have a king before. Even it's like, well, if we're gonna have a king, we don't want one like that, right? And so Belshazzar being like the steady hand on the tiller, but being a political animal, not a military animal, But you've got that. So, but the basic idea being the two main powers are Caledor and Nagaryth. Like these are Sparta and Athens. This was always the comparison that Rick used to make of like, you got the hegemony of both basically. And although some Tiranoc, isn't it, where Belshazzar comes from, I think. And these other sort of states exist, they tend to be like allied, or at least in the shadow of one or other of these really powerful. Because one side's got Anarian and the other side's got dragons, and so it's like there's a real politic there going on of like, okay, we'll serve you guys. So the fact that neither of them, and again that's why Belshazzar shows it, because he's neither of them actually. He's the balancer. If they have to pick somebody from Caledor over Malekith, then again it's actually asking for war. I think that's the beauty of the original Warhammer background is, that there's the storytelling of Bill King and then the knowledge of history, and then you've got people like Rick and that who are, again, their history and background in archaeology and all that kind of stuff, inserting these layers into stuff, which is about elves hitting each other with magic swords and stuff, but actually has the big stage stuff works. Like I say, so you got myth, but also just like it's not just like. And there's again, and also a bit of Jezzy's influence and the whole Atlantis thing, and so you've got 4 or 5, 6 different sources all going into what makes that high elf story, or the elf story at the beginning particularly, and they all work together rather than it just being one thing, rather than it just being, it's the story of Atlantis, it's the story of it's just a copy of the Peloponnesian Wars or whatever, and it's like, no, it's all of these things together, and layering them together gives us this lovely multifaceted narrative that we can explore in different ways, all with these really strong characters as well, pushing them forward in the same way that we and like I say, because that's how we view those histories as well. We don't see them just as histories, but we see them as stories of of Xerxes and Leonatus and named characters, and even before that, and they see their own stories as being descendants of Hercules and Achilles and all that. So it's a similar kind of thing. But it's a fantasy world, so it's written real, in terms of their lives. Like, no, he is the descendant of an Aryan, and and therefore he has this claim to the throne. So and playing with all of that is great fun, and doing it through a novel rather than just an army book. So, like I say, it's got that lower angle, personality, sort of character up perspective rather than history down perspective was really fun, especially moving them over to New World. And again, that the old world isn't the old world; it's the new world, and that's the fun of it. This is because this is the oldest story we can tell as well of the times of legends and stuff. Again, a lot of them stem from this. It's still the founding legend of lots of other things. You don't get Nagash without dark elves. You don't get the Empire without the elves and the dwarfs. You don't get the War of the Beard. Do you know what I mean? So it's like they're old stories. This is the oldest story. This is the greatest story ever told. Almost of from these events, the Warhammer history begins. Aside from all them chaos demons and stuff. So yeah, it's quite that gives you a lot of levers to pull. And so yeah, seeing proto Empire humans and like say Malekith and Snorri, which I loved writing Snorri and Malekith. The most hetero life partners. It's just great. And generally, I don't choke up much when I'm writing, but writing the end of Snorri and Malekith's ride to be with him at the end of stuff. Even as I was writing, I'm thinking about it now, and it's choking me up. But lovely. I don't know. You don't get to do that very often in Warhammer, so it was like it was really nice. I really got into there.
Not at all surprised that in the book about elves, there's loads of good dwarf stuff as well. Yeah, and all of that stuff with Snorri and Malekith was fantastic. And I love that you gave that room to breathe as well. It wasn't just like a chapter; it was like an elongated period of time that you could really see that friendship develop. And I agree. Yeah, it was a terrific ending, and even more tragic, knowing what Malekith will become.
Absolutely. No. Again, and that's the thing you get to play again. Not to harp on about the horse stuff, but again, it's that thing. It works on two levels. I mean, it's one of the most entertaining things for me was not with Malekith, but with Shadow King when I was doing a signing, and there was a kid at the store getting Shadow King signed, and he didn't know the history, and so the Return of the Witch King. The reveal of the Witch King, the end of Shadow King, for him was genuinely like, oh my god, the Witch King is Malekith. Spoilers, sorry. So and doing that same, but having that same thing, if you read the story, it works. If you know what's to come, it's got those echoes of irony and also tragedy of and the elves and the dwarves. But even then, in that first meeting, and he's still it's the relationship between him and Snorri that works, but the relationship between elves and dwarves will never work really. And the fact that and even then he usurps the people that are already there to take it over, and basically stabs his fellow elves in the backs for his own power because nobody else can have the ear of the High King sort of thing. So even within the kernel of that beautiful friendship is his darkness.
Yeah.
But and again, and that's cool. And it's like, but he never once tries to actually manipulate Snorri or do any of that. It's like, because actually most of his wickedness is turned on his fellow elves. That's the point. He's meant to be king. He wants to lead the elves. He wants to control the elves. The dwarfs are another factor. It's like, well, I don't want to be. And again, Snorri is much of the same mind of going out and fighting the monsters and another mold that he could see that his father probably would have allied with him and all the rest of it. So Snorri's on the good list as far as Malekith is concerned, and then therefore their genuine love and friendship can actually develop in a way that he doesn't expect.
It feels like Snorri's the only dwarf he can really fully respect, and that whole passage in the book is almost. There's a bit of hope coming through, even though we know what happens. There's a bit of hope that actually Malekith could turn out all right. He could be a good elven leader, even though we know what happens. But it feels like it's underlying. I'm guessing that was deliberate all the way through to try and balance that feeling of he's a bad guy, but he could be all right. And is it him and is it his mother and all of that kind of interwoves, I think, into it.
Yeah, I think if Morathi is the devil on one shoulder, then Snorri's probably the angel on the other for a good period. But Snorri cannot live forever. Snorri's, mortal. And that very losing him and then essentially being generally bereft at that but not wanting to return home, and so just like, well, I'm just gonna he always wants to follow his father's footsteps and just disappear into the north and die and all the rest of it, but obviously that life won't let him do that. So and therefore and has a different fate for him. So yeah, there's a lot going on. I just thinking back on it, there's a lot going on, which is great. And the crazy thing about Malekith, just from technical point of view, is it's only 100,000 words, whereas the other two books we decided we had to go up to 150,000 because it would have been better to have another 50,000 words in Malekith. Like I could have done another 20,000 words with Snorri and them having adventures and all the rest of it. So I don't know if it would have added that much more, but it would have been. There was, like I say, it doesn't feel hurried, but at the time we're like, oh, well, actually, there's trying to fit the rest of the Sundering into 2 more books. We might need to like make this a bit bigger. So maybe we should do that. Maybe we should do a special extended edition. That'd be great for the 20. It must be coming up to the 20th anniversary. But yeah, it's kind of it makes it again a very definite chapter in his life. The chapter with Snorri in it is he's probably his best once he like knifes everyone else in the back and comes to the front. Then that's his possibly his most noble time. And then after that, it's just sort of like it's a slow descent again, really.
Yeah. I mean, it is great, like you say, about just the fact that because there's so many of these points where it almost feels like this is the point of no return. Like even when he comes to the new world and just takes over by, well, not by force, but he kind of holds to ransom the elves who are there and said, well, we're going to, if you want my help, you've got to pledge loyalty to me, even though you belong to another prince. Like there's so many moments like that where it feels, oh, so this is where he turns evil. But actually, no, not at all, because he's more complicated than that, and there's more at work. And then, like you said before, there's many different influences that lead to that final turn. Because obviously you've got like the circlet of iron that he recovers as well, the magical circlet that he takes.
Yeah.
And all of that, which was very, that's a really, like he's going into the Chaos Wastes and going into this sort of Lovecraftian kind of weird vibe city. And
I love a big city.
Yeah,
big weird city. It's my Robert. I love channeling my Robert E. Howard, like strange weird city with like ancient civilization echoing things and strange proto halflings or whatever they were.
Yeah, like just totally unknown, like from before that these people existed, and who knows what they worshipped and how this thing was created. But that circlet is not what then turns him evil either. It just enhances his power and kind of adds whispers to his already, quite whisper-filled mind.
Yes, yeah. I like, that's true, and I think, that was for a couple of reasons. One, as ancient as this story is, it's, there's the prehistory of this is the history of Warhammer, but there was the prehistory of Warhammer, the time before, of dragons and dragon ogres and things, chaos and was not new. The elves lived happily on their island, kind of sheltered by the Everqueen, and there was other stuff going on, and we never really know. And so, I like that really deep time kind of aspect to it. And I say, that very sort of like that stasis almost of finding, breaking into that city and that Lovecraftian element of things beyond even the understanding of the elves, but also his inability to resist the circlet, because again, it's like that's the thing. It's not just like, oh, it's put on the evil hat and go evil. It's like, again, he's unable to resist it. It's his flaw that gets magnified by taking it rather than it creating the flaw in just by its presence, sort of thing. So and again, just make a bit more, I suppose, just another, let's say, another whisper, another voice of chaos, another little corruption along the way, but also potentially the corruption that allows him ultimately to resist his mother, because it's a different power. He's actually, this is the thing that allows him to be on par with her in terms of like literal magical power, and he's building up his own political power now, and I think that's the kind of thing of, again, with the whole going into the new world and stuff, and because there's a large part of it which, like, Morathi thinks he goes away to do that and come back, whereas actually, very much in my head, he's a ten at the beginning. He's not going to go back. He's going to create a new realm of the elves in the new world, and be its king over there. And then that doesn't quite work out the way it does. So therefore, he just goes off, and then he's granted this vision of like, oh, I could. It's again, it reminds him of that ambition, that seed of ambition of wanting to go back and maybe just go and be king of Orthwan, which is what his destiny is supposed to be, and brings him full circle. So it is, I think. And again, that's part of the story. Is like it plays with destiny and fate. That idea of like, well, we look back and all of these things seem destined to have happened, and they may well have been by some powers and stuff. But at the same time, each of them was just a step in the story that we then add a pattern to later. That none of if he zigged rather than zagged, like you say, in many occasions, things would have been very different if he'd decided, if he'd just done this rather than that. But he was himself, so he created this destiny himself. And for me, that's kind of part of the curse of Venarian. It's not a literal curse, like mystical thing, but that drive to become his father, to to be that kind of warrior king, and do things the way he did things, which is like very upfront, but also very much my way or the highway, and I'm just going to go through you, not round you, a lot of the time. So, and which way also kind of like it becomes possessed of like wanting to even later in life even try and reclaim the actual sword of Cain and all the rest of it. So it's just that, and how much of that is the fault of Morathi, of just like ever since birth, sort of like telling him how amazing his father was and that he should be his father's replacement and all the rest of it. So we can't. How much is nature, how much is nurture, and either way, it's their fault. It's like, but he just could at any one point make the right decision, and never quite does.
Yeah, although he does resist the sword of Cain in that first instance, where he goes and there's a moment when he sort of could claim it. But I quite like that as well, because like you said, that it's sometimes it can be a bit of a crutch to have a character who is just, oh well, he's possessed now. He's gone evil now because he's picked up the cursed sword. So him resisting it allows his evil to be his own almost. Which is quite nice.
Yeah, I mean it's it's very much a me novel because again, one of the themes I like to come back to, which is power and what is the source of power, and having a character like Malekith has been around enough that he understands that any power that's kind of borrowed is actually not his, and that's where the sword comes in. It's like, well, actually, it destroyed his father. He understands that actually his father borrowed that power to destroy the demons and things, but it ultimately led to his downfall. Now he recognizes that and understands that actually, and if he's not going to be a slave to Morathi, and he's not going to be a slave to anyone else, then he's damn well not going to be a slave to a sword or a scepter. And has that, his very ambition is the thing that protects him almost from the lure of the curse of Cain, because it's like he won't, unlike Morathi, who again succumbs. She's weak. She turns to worship of Cain as much as turns to worship of Slanesh. She's been borrowing power from day one, and she's got the magical Ponzi scheme from hell basically all the way up for 7,000 years until finally there's payback sort of thing, and even then there isn't. She sort of comes out the other side and turns into a giant snake. But and eventually does become like a demigod. So I suppose it worked out for her in the end. So it turned out nice. So So again, his opposite is very much always wanted to be his own person on his own terms, and that's as much as he makes bad decisions in terms of that, it also makes good decisions in terms of like resisting his mother, resisting the crown, the circlet, resisting the sword and stuff. But ultimately, at the end, there's the one thing he can't resist, which is his own self-preservation. Really, he's not willing to sacrifice himself for what he wants.
It's actually
and he's not willing to serve Belshazzar. Basically, that's the final straw. Basically,
and that's a unfortunate balance for the rest of the elves, because perhaps if he wasn't so sort of strong-willed himself, and he had turned evil at one of those earlier points, it sort of revealed himself when he wasn't as powerful, wasn't as well positioned to do what he did, that he would have been more easily defeated potentially.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and definitely would have been. I think, definitely wouldn't have consolidated his power back in Orthwan and all the rest of it. It wouldn't have the complete set of like martial like mystical and political power, which is what he ultimately has in the end, I suppose, is it being able to bind all of those together. Whereas, if he'd just come back with an army and tried to conquer him, then even Nagaryth would have resisted him. If he'd just come back as a powerful sorcerer, again, it wouldn't have been quite the same. And actually, coming back with a sword of Cain would have been terrible, and everyone would have been like, "No, we don't want, we don't need an Aryan reborn." That's like, we saw how that happened, especially in Caledor, because again, that's the thing is, again, it obviously pays off across the trilogy, and we don't see as much of it in Malekith, but that Nagaryth, Caledor and the dragons is the power that balances it, and actually, that's always the thing he knows he's going to have to try and take on. And he can't take it on directly because there isn't a power, and which is why it's so tempted to have a big magic sword and whatever. But actually, he has to be legitimate, because otherwise, the realm of Caledor would obviously just renounce it, and there's potential civil war. Just others would rally against him, which of course is what happens in the end. But that it's the threat of Caledor and what they have is prevents him being able to return just by sheer force of arms taking over, which is why he has to try and at least pretend legitimately to become the Phoenix King. Badly.
I'm curious about the sort of technical aspect, or the mechanical aspect, I suppose, of writing a book in a trilogy like this. So obviously there's a framework of this history already existing within the Warhammer world. There's been a couple of generations of that in the army's books. You've got are you literally like writing a long list of, I need to get to this and this and this, these characters need to interact, this magic item has to be collected, this thing has to happen over here, and then you're sort of working through it, or like, what's the approach to that?
Yeah, that was pretty much it, really. Across the trilogy, and it's one of the reasons why we went up to 150,000 words for the second and third books, which was just looking at the number of beats that had to go into each of those, and having seen what we kind of got into Malekith, but there was a couple of squeezed bits and stuff like that, just going, no, this needs more room. Like, which of these do we skip over and stuff? And it's like, we don't want any of them to be skipped over, really. Particularly looking forward, Shadow King was enough of everything that happens in Caledor, which is like the Sundering proper in the war. The rest of it, lots and lots happening there. So it's like, no, it is going to need room to breathe. But that was kind of more of a, like I say, post-Malekith realization. But trying to look at them, so there are events, but trying to look at them as kind of character beats was the important thing. So you go, well, these are the things that we know he did. And again, this was a bit of a lesson from, like a bit of back and forth with the heresy stuff, which is like, we know the what, but actually investigating the how and the why is what's really interesting. So we know he went to the New World, but they go and present that in a way that's slightly different. We know he becomes friends with Snorri and they go off campaigning and they meet humans, but make that a bit different to what people are expecting, And so that's got a bit of a revelation about it. But yeah, I mean, across, it's decided that across the three books, like, so, the Massacre at the Shrine is like it was just because the end. It's essentially the fall of Malekith. So that's his story, and then looking at how we broke up the rest of the events and where we could focus on the Shadow King, where we could focus on the Phoenix King. And in that chronology worked quite well, because there's a lot of to and fro, and then there's the final war sort of thing. But trying to tell the story at different levels as well. So, still getting those big beats in, but making them, like I say, making them character arcs was the difficult thing, rather than just like turning up and witnessing, making sure that, well, we tick the box, he's done this thing now. And adding some stuff in, again, like I say, not necessarily just doing the hits that are in the timeline, but actually trying to add some particulars in terms of, well, you got a very bland statement like, Malekith travels to the New World or whatever, and you're like, okay, what does that actually mean? Okay, let's turn that into an event. Let's turn it into this is where can we show, not tell, that story kind of old sort. But this is kind of like the examples of doing it. He goes into the gas waste and finds the circlet of iron. Okay, what does that actually mean? How does that turn into a scene, a chapter, or a piece of story, and all the way through, looking at, okay, the big beats of the Sundering, and there's the fall of the Eagle Gate. What does that actually mean? Well, how do we turn that into a story element? How does that relate to a character point of view rather than just being an historical event? How do we and do that all the way through and divide that between the 3 books of like, well, what's a sensible cut-off point of events, and how do we uncover that? So and there was a few bits as well where we sort of like looked at stuff and went, that's kind of, although it's happening, we just can't cover that in too much detail. Because there's not necessarily room, but 2, because they're not necessarily that interesting from a character point of view. So again, it's like, well, there's lots of fighting going on, and you could have endless chapters of like, we're going to have a war over here. Talking about more time with Snorri, it's like, I would have definitely used it to maybe just do one or two. Again, it would have been just to find 1 or 2 little incidents to build up their relationship and show that, rather than focusing too much on the we're fighting more chaos beasts, and that's kind of, because that's not the story. That's just kind of what's going on while the story happens. So it's in some ways having to cut the cloth quite tight is good in a way, because it stops you being indulgent and just like, oh well, we'll just have we can fight some orcs now. We haven't fought any orcs. It's like, well, that's just it's kind of interesting on a surface level, but unless you can find some way to turn that into a character story, it's not really relevant, is it? So there was, like I said, there was a lot of material there already, quite nicely laid out, because we had timelines and lots of maps and things anyway, so it made it a bit easier.
Just on that, actually, I mean, and this maybe goes back to your time as Lawmaster, but is there like a Bible? Was there like a big Bible that was like, this is every event that's happened to every character and every army in the Warhammer world? Or was it just, is that just knowledge that's in people's heads collectively across the studio?
I think at the time, because even like getting to the 6th edition army books and things, like, leaving aside sort of like the slight variation that happened with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay background and like, so from Rick's kind of consolidation of 4th edition Warhammer, a lot of stuff hadn't really changed. Stuff's been represented and bits been layered on and things, but there hadn't been like the explosion of stories and rewrites and adding stuff on. Most of, so like with the elves in particular, 4th edition to 5th edition High Elf Armies book was mostly army list, and Thomas was like, very sensibly did mostly cosmetic changes to the history section. And again, although we presented slightly differently, the same was true from 5th to 6th edition and stuff. It's like, well, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. This is like, we don't have to replace this with new material. So actually, there wasn't a lot that I didn't know, because I'd obviously been absorbing this stuff for years and working very closely with it as well, my Lawmaster, but also just like, we tried very hard to make sure that the latest army book was the definitive guide, was that Bible, which was a bit different, because we never went through, I think particularly because, in 40k we ended up doing like the small codexes and ended up excising loads of stuff, and then basically, they kind of got rebooted and started again, whereas we never quite had that. The army books were a bit smaller, the first ones, but actually we never really had to throw out everything and just kind of put snippets and stuff in. So there was a consistency of that story all the way through. So we were able to say, no, look at the latest army book. That is the Bible of the elves. And if there were 1 or 2 things like we dropped out, some of the story of Alethanar, or there was, an expanded bit somewhere else, that was very specific research, rather than, oh no, actually, it was in this book over here and this campaign book over here, and this, it was just neater, and there was a lot less of it, basically. It was again, it was like 25 years less of of development, really, I suppose. But I think, I'd be very specific in time and place. Warhammer's strength and its weakness was it was very much, it's one world, like this city is here, this river is here, this place here, which makes it very easy to ground stuff and makes it very relevant. But on the flip side, for some people, obviously it lacks room. You can't blow up entire planets and just not worry about it and stuff. But actually, the good thing is it's very grounded and real, and didn't change a lot, because you're having to interleave it into an existing like fiction. So you could kind of expand on historical elements, but you were never like, oh, actually, there was a whole other Phoenix King we never talked about, because it's there in the Tale of Kings. They're all there, what they did and why. And again, that one in particular, and the Undead, those books had huge amounts of information in them, which was great. Whereas once you get to some of the later ones, trying to because of the nature of them to kind of keep their records and have that continuity across 7,000 years of history. Whereas orcs and goblins are a bit more scattergun. You can invent an orc warlord and then a rampage that nobody ever heard of because well, it was Tuesday.
I guess I'm curious. You mentioned at the top that the Time of Legends as a series was almost a Warhammer Fantasy reaction to Horus Heresy's success. And you might not be able to talk about this, but were the Time of Legends considered the kind of success that Warhammer was looking for in the fiction space?
Oh yeah, I mean, sales wise, just on that alone, yeah, they sold as well as good 40k books. So not heresy levels, but nothing does because it's all. But for the time, or even for now, really, I think the Time of Legends definitely had the popularity. It started. I'm not quite sure what happened to it because it did. I'm not sure if it waned or if just internal kind of appeal went for it because the sort of it kind of fell out of favor really fast.
Right.
We had the Sundering went really well. Graham's Empire stuff was really good and went really well. We had Clint Werner's doing doing the Skaven and the Boris Goldgather and Plagues and Plague of Winter or whatever it is. And stuff, and that again seemed to do really well. And then, but for some reason, we sort of, for us to say, for the longest time, I was chatting to Nick Kime, the editor, and having an eye on the War of Vengeance, and this is Sundering 2, right? If not more. In fact, 3 books from the Elves, 3 books from the Dwarfs. This would be awesome. And that was the scope of my thinking at the time. And then we just about got 2 books out of it, I think, didn't we? And they suddenly just reined back kind of the scope of it, and to the point again that we were talking before, Gordon, about doing the Dragonback. We started getting one-off books rather than series and stuff. So, so it was a real shame, and I don't know, and it may have been just an understandable. There may have been an understandable political change within GW, which was these are really successful, but wouldn't it be great if we could just make actual regular Warhammer this is successful, rather than harking back to the legends and stuff. I don't know. There wasn't any particular explanation, and I wasn't that I said didn't have that much of an inside track on how the other series were going, other than anecdotally, really. So, but it was quite disappointing for me that, particularly with the War of Beard, War of Vengeance stuff, that for me had particularly because I'd worked on Grudge Lore with Nick, which was this great delving into dwarf history, and I'd done a bit of section on the War of Vengeance and stuff like that, and it's in the same way it just reminds me there's just so much to mine here. It would be brilliant, and all we have to do is find the right character stories to tell it, and I think that's part of the issue, was just maybe just a slight lack of vision on what it could be, or just becoming risk averse, wanting to do something else with those resources, I guess, because I can imagine it would have sold a few.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess just thinking as well, and on the trilogy as a whole, obviously the scope and scale of it's massive. I'm imagining Snorri is one of your favorite characters, but having spent so much time with all those elves, is there an elf who sort of stood out as your favorite to write and to spend time with?
I mean, I did really love Malekith, actually, because he's glorious and genuinely glorious after glory, and his story is the story of the Sundering more than anyone else. So he was probably my favorite, and I did also love this, him and Morathi kind of basically chewing the furniture, chewing the scenery when they're ever in a scene together later on, particularly when he goes full Witch King. So it was, and I really liked trying to get an angle on Calidor. Imric Calador, because it's one of those things where you've got to be careful when you're writing background. And bless him, all that Bill did all this wonderful history and stuff. Essentially, he describes Calador as this monosyllabic sort of like, he's the ultimate laconic kind of king, literally supposed to be like the Spartan king. So it's like, what does all this mean? And his one word reply is war. It's like, well, I can't write in a whole book with one of the characters' dialogue being like monosyllabic replies to stuff. So he's going to have to be a little bit more forthcoming. But he's still quite, So that was quite fun, just trying to make it like that sort of laconic, taciturn in character. And he's the opposite in many ways. He's the opposite to Malekith because he's not actually that charismatic, but and he doesn't really even want to be in the position he's in. He's the opposite. He's the reluctant leader. He's the leader they need rather than the leader that they want. He kind of grows into position. So it's a nice contrast. Whereas Alith is kind of just a bit wild, and he was very, he kind of sort of came from nowhere, this sort of Shadow King, and I think, so there was a lot of scope because he was one of the ones that didn't have a lot of material existing. We knew he was, what he was, and there's a few, he was very much kind of like in that trickster myth mold, but like sort of very twisted trickster, like, oh yeah, and then then they found all the corpses nailed to the the wall of the gate 2 days later. So trying to blend that kind of really dark horribleness with like a guy who decides to steal a bridge, and stuff like that was a lot of fun as well. And he's is possibly the most tragic of the stories because he starts off quite happy, and he's the one who has everything taken from him and becomes this horrible object of vengeance. So all of the main characters are cool, but I suppose we're going back to the beginning of Carathril and the everyman caught up in it as well. I suppose that was a nice trying to make sense of what's going on and not really getting it, I suppose. But yeah, I think overall Malekith was just the most fun to kind of get in because there was lots of great story, but actually enough for him to be, you could write a villain and a hero and an anti-hero all at the same time. Don't often get to do that.
Yeah. There's a lovely little plot device with Carathril as well, just around that final message that he's supposed to deliver to Imric, and the fact that it's in Malekith goes unfulfilled, but we as an audience know he's got it. So we've got more information going into. Oh, well, and obviously we've got information about Malekith's plans as well. But there's this little bit of information that we've got that more or less no one else has as a reader going into that final sequence, which is really nice and kind of it's a lovely thread to have dangling at the end of the story as well.
Yeah, I think so, and that's why sometimes it's good to step out into other perspectives and just layer in, or another character viewpoint that you can just say. Meanwhile, over here there's a thing, the fleet of masses or whatever. It's cool. So you don't and not having to be wedded, because I think one of the problems with a lot of storytelling, especially films and stuff these days, is these days character would have to have an entire story arc to justify his existence, as opposed to just like being more of a, obviously it's like he has enough of a story to understand him as a character, but he's not a secondary character as such in that, he doesn't have to have like 30,000 words devoted to him so we understand who he is. This is not an ensemble story. This is Malekith's story, but occasionally you have to break away from Malekith for context, and Carathril, Morathi, and some of the other characters in the other books give us a bit of that perspective when we need to, which is funnily enough something I'm just thinking about again with the book I'm writing at the moment, of like, we're going to focus on these two characters, but you don't have to be just wedded to two characters. You can have you can, if you need to break away and just have somebody for a little bit. It's quite easy to end up just like imposing rules on yourself about, oh right, it's going to be close to fixed point of view from this character all the way through. So yeah, but that's going to make it difficult. Well, I'll just have a scene with this guy then. That's fine. It doesn't, absolutism doesn't help writing. So it's not first person. It's fine. You can break away to somebody else. Carathril, definitely. From his humble beginnings as not quite the right person to tell that big story, still, the things he does is still enough to, the actual events, but also his role is the same, I suppose, as kind of observer of other things away from the main characters. So yeah. Yeah, it's say funny to think about that 20 years later, really.
Well, yeah, it was fantastic. So, Stu, is there anything else that you'd like to put before Gav whilst we've still got him?
No, I think we've covered it really at the end there. I had questions about the growth of the potential growth of that series as opposed to the Horus Heresy one, which I love as well. And as a Warhammer fan, I wished it was as big. But I think we kind of covered that really, is that it felt like it just drifted away a little bit and you weren't quite sure why the interest tailed away. But there was definitely a lot of more stories that it's a shame they weren't told, and it feels like they won't get told now, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there was a few, that again, I suppose they sort of got touched on a little bit, and we tried to do them in various other ways. But there's whole bits with the Great War Against Chaos was an obvious one, and the coming of, the coming of the elves back to the old world and stuff. And the thing for me that I liked about the fact that we should have invested in those stories is that then they create, like I said, they created that continuity of legends within legends. So the elves, you've almost got a trilogy of trilogies, which is like Sundering, which is the elves and the formative years of the elves as we know them coming to the old world, and then you've got the War of the Beard / War of Adventure, them leaving the old world, and then the Great War Against Chaos, which is the elves returning to the old world for the last time, the last war kind of thing, and that gives it the whole world continuity and an epic scope, and everything's related. It's not like and also just like then sets. What I like is they contextualize modern Warhammer, the Empire as we understand it. It's not like the mistake was always to portray it, and I don't think it did that particularly, but it's like, well, it was not like this 1,000 years ago. It was a different place, because these things, the Great War Against Chaos is relatively recent, and the Colleges of Magic are relatively recent, and all the rest of these things. So you go and not to take those as granted, and saying and actually, so then there's also just a little bit of human history across them, because humans are still around, kind of caught in between the dwarfs and the elves fighting over it. It's like that would have been a great angle to have a human character in it, maybe observing these armies marching past and shit going down, completely apocalyptic from their point of view of these huge powers, and but also very deliberately, again in my head, the elves leaving the old world is why the Empire is kind of it's really more of a dwarf founded. And the elves had a little bit more via the wood elves and stuff effect on Bretonia, whereas the Empire, I think, is like their alliances have always been with the dwarfs, and not necessarily so overt, but that's why they're more machine minded and more you feel like they ally more naturally with the dwarfs than they do the elves, because the elves deserted them, they left the old world, and that's not just because seeing what happened to rescue Kurgan Ironbeard and get given the hammer but actually that naturally the two had already been the dwarfs had already seen the humans as a bit of a bulwark against orcs and beastmen and stuff, and had already been working with them a little bit after the elves went away. But again, these two powers very much diminished, and that's the rise of man. And that's kind of again, it's that it's a history created by somebody who understands the historical ebb and flow of empires and power from one place to another, and the fact that they don't stay consistent, and that for one to rise, another generally has to fall. You don't, and the problem, that was the thing about the elves and dwarfs, is that they would fight, they could not, regardless of anything else, of any kind of misunderstandings and beards getting shaven and stuff like that, they were incompatible there, and the two powers could not coexist peacefully in the old world, or what was then the new world for the elves, and so war was inevitable at some point over something, and exploring all those things would be in novels would be awesome, but we never, we unfortunately it wasn't quite. Didn't quite come to pass in that way fully, but oh well.
I suppose actually the trajectory that the old world's taking, we're not actually far away from the Great War Against Chaos. So if anything was going to be given its time to be told in novelized form, it would be that. So we live in hope.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, yes, and Graham's already done. We have had an old world novel, a new old world novel. So there is. You're right. There is, and that's definitely that sort of that period of the old world from the the three emperors forward into sort of like leading up to the rise of Magnus the Pious, and things are shifting in amongst the Chaos tribes and powers. So it's true that I don't know how consistent the plan is for the Old World novels range of like whether that'll be a really strong narrative or whether it'll just be like sort of highlighted individual stories set in that period. I don't know, but there's definitely you can see that progression, and it's nice. It's seeing the Old World stuff, and it's like having a nice comfy pair of slippers to go back to. So with maybe spikes in because it's Warhammer, but
skulls on top for sure.
Yeah, skull slippers coming to the merch store near you. Warhammer slippers. That's it now.
They'll sell. That would be very popular.
Probably probably. I wouldn't be surprised.
Well,
the dressing gown in your chapter colours.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean they exist. You can already get those. You can get.
Well, it's adepts robes. That's for the adepts robes, wouldn't it be? I'm sure.
I really like the American football jerseys, but I think they've missed a chance of making them into Blood Bowl teams, or just rather than just Space Marine chapters. I think there's a missed opportunity there. All made up things. The Nuln Oilers would have been brilliant for a
the Nuln Oilers is a great
joke. Yeah, but maybe they'll come.
Yeah, well, it's true. There's many more years to come yet. So,
well, I'm sure we could wax lyrical about Warhammer merch for many hours, and of course the history of the elves and everything else. But we'll let you go, Gav, because otherwise we'll take your entire day. But thank you so much for joining us to chat about Malekith and your work, telling these amazing stories.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to go talk about them actually, and go back and revisit a very fondly remembered project that I've not thought about for quite a while. So thank you for that.
Massive thanks to Gav for joining us to chat about Malekith. It was a fantastic book and a fantastic conversation. You can find Stu on the internet anywhere you go under Miniature Realms, and you can find me under Jordan Sorcery. We've got BLUESKY accounts, we've got Instagram, we've got Patreon. All of the links are down in the description below. Go and check out our other stuff. If you enjoyed this and you enjoy our work, then we would love to hear from you wherever you spend your time on the internet. Thanks very much again to Gav, thanks to Stu, and thanks to you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.